was not really an expert at all. He had just taken 40 hours of a class that was basically an introductory class. So I want to continue reading because I think it's really interesting and it sheds a lot of light on the trial of Joe Bryan and kind of the injustice that he sustained. So this is part 3 of the article. My experience in Yukon left me with more questions than answers. Let's put this down again. Prompting me to reach out to 2 respected forensic scientists, Peter DeForest and Ralph Ristenbad. DeForest got criminalistics for 39 years at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and studied in the 1960s under Paul Leland Kirk, a biochemist and forensic scientist who established a pioneering academic program in criminalistics at the University of California, Berkeley, in the 1950s. Ristenbad teaches forensic science at Penn State University and is a former student of DeForest's. Both men have been sharply critical of the phenomenon of the 40-hour class and of the huge leap that police officers who take such classes and who lack rigorous scientific education often make when they use bloodstains to create a wholesale reconstruction of a crime. Curious what he and Ristenbad would make of Thorman's findings, I provided them with some basic information about the Bryan case, including the autopsy report, Thorman's report, testimony, and copies of photos in the flashlight and crime scene. Thorman himself had not examined the flashlight in person. He based his findings on photos alone. That's out of control. DeForest and Ristenbad were troubled by the significance that the prosecution ascribed to the flashlight, which Ristenbad noted was an isolated piece of evidence, found in isolation and without context. Because it was not recovered at the crime scene, its history is completely unknown. We don't know when the blood got onto it or This technique did not stay in the lab for long. In 1973, Herbert Leon McDonald, a research chemist and criminalist in Corning, New York, decided to take the complex concepts Kirk applied in the Shepard case, namely fluid dynamics and high-level math, and make them accessible to law enforcement. He did so by teaching what he called week-long institutes at police departments around the country. He believed that investigators could use the droplets, splatters, and trails of blood at crime scenes to reconstruct the conditions at the moment of bloodshed. Flight characteristics and stain patterns of human blood was a report that he wrote early in his career. This mirrored what Kirk tried to do in the Shepard case. As McDonald spread the gospel of bloodstain interpretation, he instilled in police officers, some of whom had only a high school education, the belief that they, too, could unlock the secrets of a crime scene so long as they possessed keen observational skills, a scientific calculator, and the requisite course fees, which ranged from $200 to $700. Of the more than 1,000 people McDonald taught, some went on to lead bloodstain classes themselves, passing on his teachings to an ever-widening circle of police officers, investigators, and forensic examiners. Many of these self-styled bloodstain interpreters testified as expert witnesses in trials, citing the classes they took as evidence of their proficiency. McDonald himself testified around the country for 4 decades, helping to build bloodstain pattern analysis, reputation, and legitimacy. Some defense attorneys whose clients were convicted on the basis of McDonald's testimony began questioning whether this forensic discipline was as reliable as he claimed. Yet appellate courts in state after state upheld his right to testify as an expert. In 1980, when the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed the use of bloodstain pattern analysis in State versus Hall, a case in which a man was convicted of stabbing his girlfriend to death, it explained its reasoning by citing McDonald's extensive experience, his standing as the field's leading expert, the existence of bloodstain pattern analysis courses at several major schools, and its use by police departments around the country. These were all credentials that traced back to McDonald. Rather than serve as gatekeepers who assessed the credibility of supposed scientific testimony before admitting it into evidence, many judges simply depended on the previous use of bloodstain pattern analysis in the courts when deciding whether to allow it. Legal precedent, not science, served as their guide, which is very dangerous. McDonald continued to be a sought-after expert witness, and in 1995 he testified for the defense at the O.J. Simpson trial, arguing that a sock found on Simpson's bedroom floor, which was stained with the blood of his murdered ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, was not the irrefutable proof of guilt that it appeared to be. The blood had not spattered onto the sock at the scene of the crime, but rather had been transferred onto the sock by someone's hand or an object. He told the jury, advancing the defense's claim that Simpson was not a killer, but the victim of a police frame-up. bloodstains can reveal only so much. Their shape, dimension, location, and distribution may offer classic clues about what occurred. A trail of blood leading away from a victim, for example, might indicate that the perpetrator was injured when he fled, and may sometimes allow analysts to calculate where the bloodletting originated. But bloodstains are just one discrete part of the evidence left behind at a crime scene. Practitioners who rely on only such fragmentary pieces of information to reconstruct crimes are often engaging in nothing more than guesswork. Ultimately, they can offer a theory, as McDonald did in the Simpson trial. It is not unusual, in fact, for bloodstain pattern analysis to face off in court, having drawn diametrically opposite conclusions. In one trial I attended, the prosecution's expert saw proof of murder, and the defense's expert saw suicide. Each pointed to the very same bloodstains as evidence. Part 4. Leon Smith did not succeed in landing a commitment from Unsolved Mysteries, but he was able to turn away from the Whitley and Bryan murders. He was unable to turn away from the murders. The cases preoccupied him, demanding his attention, and he decided to undertake his own investigation. As he tried to tease out which investigative avenues to follow, he focused on what law enforcement had not. He learned everything he could about the two men who were seen with freshly painted van at the Ford dealership, discovering that the son of one of them had been a 4th grade student of Mickey's in the fall of 1985. He made timelines, pored over public records, and once went through a man's trash. He tried to recreate a scenario that Joe Willie, the Texas Ranger who led the investigation into Mickey's murder, described at both of Joe's trials. Neither of the Bryans smoked, and the cigarette butt which was found on the kitchen floor seemed like powerful evidence that an intruder had been in the home, until Willie testified that he inadvertently dragged it in from outside on the bottom of his boot. Smith waited to conduct his experiment until the weather was damp from a recent storm, just as it was the morning Mickey's body was found. I stepped on cigarette butts in my boots for a whole hour, Smith told me, and couldn't get one to stick to my heel for more than a step or two. Smith periodically shared his findings with Jim Vanderhoop, and though the police chief agreed that Joe's case was worthy of further examination, he didn't pursue it. Vanderhoop focused instead on the Whitley case, sharing details with Smith that reporters are rarely privy to in an open investigation. It was during one such conversation that Vanderhoop disclosed an explosive piece of information. The primary suspect in the Whitley case had been a Clifton police officer named Dennis Dunlap, who abruptly resigned and left town a month after the teenager's murder. Sheila has decided to join us, but let me just say what I said again. There was a primary suspect in the case of the teenage girl who was murdered in the same town as Mickey only months prior, and that suspect questioned the integrity of the police department enough by that point that I was not entirely surprised. Vanderhoof told him that Dunlap had led a peripatetic life, skipping from one small town law enforcement agency to the next. The chief had managed to track him down to the town of Needville, southwest of Houston. Vanderhoof wanted to question Dunlap, but told Smith he did not think he had sufficient grounds to do so, because no new information about his possible involvement had come to light. Smith offered to help, and with the chief's approval and guidance, he wrote to Dunlap in the fall of 1991, explaining that for a story he was writing, he was reaching out to everyone who served on the force at the time of the Whitley murder. Dunlap's handwritten answers to the broad questions Smith posed about the case were short and perfunctory. Smith pressed Dunlap to explain the erratic behavior that brought him under such suspicion in 1985. Ex-Chief Bryan told me that I was not a suspect. Dunlap eventually wrote back. For 6 years, you're the only one who has contacted me in regard to the Whitley case. Then he went silent, never responding to Smith again. Dunlap's stonewalling signified a dead end in an investigation that would turn up many provocative connections. Dunlap, Smith learned, was friendly with the two men at the car dealership, but no hard proof of who killed Judy Whitley or who was present in the Bryan home on the night of the murder. I know not if anything will ever come of the time we spent chasing rabbit trails and cold leads, Smith lamented in a 1995 Record column about his continuing re-examination of the 2-decade-old murders. Yet it was Smith's letters to Dunlap that would finally break open the Whitley case the following spring. On April 12, 1996, the police in Rosenberg, Texas, where Dunlap had moved and taken a job as a maintenance man, responded to a 911 call placed by his girlfriend. When they arrived at his house, they found that Dunlap, who was 49 years old, had hanged himself in the garage. During the ensuing search of the house, officers found the letters that Smith wrote tucked away in a dresser drawer in Dunlap's was his long history of violence against women. One victim said Dunlap choked her after she refused to have sex with him, warning, "I could kill you, and you know it." Smith wondered how, if at all, this new information related to Mickey Bryan's murder. Before Vanderhoof died, while the investigation was still underway, Smith said the chief told him that someone who was questioned, he would not say who, claimed that Dunlap once bragged that he and the school teacher had been together the night she was killed. Smith did not know if there was any truth to the statement, but he wanted to delve deeper. He was acutely aware that if he didn't, no one else would. As far as anyone else at the police department was concerned, the Bryan case was closed. People openly laughed at my idiocy for pursuing it. In the years that followed, as Smith became consumed with new obligations, he was forced to scale back his investigation. In 2000, he started a newspaper he called the Lone Star Iconoclast in Crawford, 20 miles away, shortly before its most prominent resident, George W. Bush, was inaugurated as president. The following years, in a bit of civic-mindedness, he ran for mayor of Clifton, and he won. Though he was busier than ever, he wrote to Joe when he could. When Joe wrote back, he did not dwell on the indignities of prison life or mention his private turmoil, like his anguish over not being able to attend his mother's funeral in 2002. He talked about his hope, and that he would one day be given the chance to live in Houston with his older brother James, who had pledged to take him in if he were ever paroled. "I am fortunate to have a place to go," he noted, explaining that he had exhausted all his savings on lawyers for trials and subsequent appeals. As Smith went about his work, Joe's case was never far from his mind. But after conducting scores of interviews, accruing realms of documents, and spending untold hours puzzling over the murder, he remained stymied. "I couldn't fit all the pieces together," Smith told me. "I didn't think Joe did it, but that wasn't enough. He had taken every detour, at one point even staking out the post office after he'd been receiving bizarre, anonymous letters, bearing Clifton postmarks that claimed Mickey was killed because she knew too much about local drug activity, but he never succeeded in identifying their author." In the years since Smith first visited the Walls, Joe had lost all his appeals, and Smith came to feel a personal stake in the outcome of his case. "I thought I should be able to figure it out," Smith said, "and I apologized to him many times that I couldn't." Part 5. In the fall of 2000, as Smith was contemplating running for mayor, the TV series CSI premiered on CBS. Wow, that was a long time ago, 20 years ago. The police procedural, which presented a world in which complex crimes could be cracked by the sheer force of forensic scrutiny, would go on to become the most watched TV show in the world. That's crazy. While its characteristics were capricious, the science they practiced was not. As they analyzed blood spatter, lifted latent fingerprints, and examined other physical and biological evidence left behind at crime scenes, their conclusions carried the aura of infallibility. "People lie," the show's hard-boiled lead investigator, Gil Grissom, once declared. "The only thing we can count on is the evidence." But at CSI, sat atop the Nielsen ratings through the 2000s, spawning a new genre that included Showtime's Dexter about a bloodstain pattern analyst who spent his off hours avenging the deaths of crime victims. Forensic science was facing a sudden reckoning. The advent of DNA analysis in the late 1980s had not only transformed the future of criminal investigations, it also helped illuminate the past, holding old convictions and the forensic work that helped win them up to scrutiny. Rather than affirming the soundness of forensic science, DNA testing exposed its weaknesses. Of the 250 DNA exonerations that occurred by 2010 throughout the United States, bad forensic work, which ranged from making basic lab errors to advancing claims unsupported by science, had contributed to half of them, according to a review by the Innocence Project. The sheer number of people who were imprisoned using faulty science called into question the premise of forensics itself. Just how reputable were these methods, and what exactly were expert witnesses' opinions based on? In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences sought to answer those questions with a groundbreaking and damning report. Its authors found that many forensic disciplines, including the analysis of blood spatter, hairs, bite marks, and shoe and tire impressions, and handwriting, were not as scientific as they often purported to be. Rather than being firmly grounded in hard data and rigorous peer-reviewed research, many of these disciplines relied on the individual judgments of practitioners. The report included a sobering appraisal of bloodstain interpretation. Analysts' opinions were often more subjective than scientific, its authors warned, and open to context basis. They noted that some experts extrapolate far beyond what can be supported. Moreover, the complex patterns that fluids make when exiting wounds are highly variable, they observed, and in many cases their interpretations are difficult or impossible. In conclusion, the authors cautioned the uncertainties associated with bloodstain pattern analysis are enormous. Such uncertainties can have catastrophic real-life consequences for those accused of crimes. In one notorious case in 2000, David Cam, a former Indiana State Trooper, told law enforcement that he had come home from playing basketball to find his wife and 2 children shot to death in their garage. Despite the fact that numerous witnesses placed Cam at the basketball game, around the time of the murders, investigators believed that he was the killer. Over the course of 3 trials, prosecutors presented a succession of bloodstain pattern analysis who testified that 8 specks of blood found on the t-shirt he wore that night were high-velocity impact splatter, which suggested that he was present at the time of the shooting. The defense produced its own bloodstain experts who argued that the specks in question were actually transfer stains.